For Lesson 10, we're going to continue and finish our primary discussion of Dracula, continue to discuss the novel and fiction and how to approach fiction as a genre, a literary form, how to study it. And in doing these tasks, our purpose is fourfold. First, we're going to talk about the rise of the novel and specific components of the novel, because in the previous lesson we talked about fiction in general. We're going to narrow our focus to the novel. We're also going to discuss the ending to Dracula, a little bit about its narrative structure now that we've read the whole novel, and some themes that are worth either visiting for the first time or revisiting now that we've read the whole novel. The third purpose is to look at the cultural documents that are contained in the Bedford edition. Not quite as extensive as the Bedford Macbeth edition, because it also has the criticism, which we'll be looking at in the next lesson, but still a thorough section on important cultural background that will be really beneficial to read, so we'll talk about that. And then finally a little bit about the way Dracula and vampires in general have been used in our media heavily the last 15 to 20 years and become quite popular, and what you think about that. The rise of the English novel. Obviously novels are written in countries other than England, and we'll address that, but in the mid-19th century the novel became very, very popular in England, and thousands upon thousands of novels were published in England during the late 19th century, and this led to the novel eventually becoming more popular in other countries. So, before the mid-19th century, very few novels were published, as I mentioned before, due to low literacy rates. The first novel, what most scholars regard as the first novel, is a medieval text called The Tale of Genji, which is a novel published by a Japanese woman during the medieval period, and most scholars regard that as the first novel. And it predates any other novels by a number of centuries. After that, you have a few examples, a few early examples, Cervantes' Don Quixote, Afraben's Orinoco, that are early examples of the novel. Orinoco is shorter, though it's almost really a novella. A lot of critics regard Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe as the first novel written in the English language. But even once Robinson Crusoe is published in the mid-18th century, it's still a long time before novels start to become widely written, generally popular. In the late 18th, early 19th century, you have a few writers publishing fairly prolifically. Sir Walter Scott, who wrote Waverley and Ivanhoe, and is credited with the first depiction of Robin Hood in the novel, writing in the late 18th, early 19th century, was really the first very highly prolific novelist, wrote a lot of novels. Jane Austen, she wrote 7 novels around the same time. They're probably the two most famous early British novelists. Anne Radcliffe wrote a fair amount then too. You have people in the U.S. too, like Charles Brockden Brown writing. But compared to 50 years after Sir Walter Scott and Jane Austen are writing, there are not very many novels published that time, again because of the low literacy rates. Novels, even short ones, are too long to be read aloud, at least in their entirety, in any kind of public format. So illiterate people had no use for novels whatsoever, and in most Western countries and a lot of Eastern countries, the literacy rates were very low until the mid-19th century. During the Victorian period, which technically begins in 1936 when Queen Victoria takes the throne in England, there were numerous reforms. The first reform bill was technically passed in 1832, 4 years before she became queen, and that was a big one. Both these reforms were positive and negative in many ways. There's a wide variety of reforms during this period, but most notably there were a lot of educational reforms. And because of this, the middle and working class started to learn to read for the first time. And once the middle and lower class could read, trends started to change. Poetry and drama which before were the most popular because they could be spoken, and you didn't need to be literate to enjoy them, started to be thought of as more kind of highfalutin and for the upper class and for the aristocracy. And the middle and working classes who were able to read for the first time wanted to read something else. And they really found the novel appealing as a literary form. So the popularity of the novel skyrocketed in the mid-19th century as literacy rates improved. The number of novels published is crazy. If you look at from the 1850s on compared to the 1850s before, I mean, it's multiplied by thousands, the sheer number. You know, when Sir Walter Scott and Jane Austen are writing, they're some of the only few, and then 50 years later there's hundreds of novelists and thousands of novels being published every year. So it's a dramatic shift because of this education reform, because the middle and working classes learn to read. Obviously, when something becomes popular, money becomes involved. So early on, the novel had several iterations that made it beneficial for publishing companies. And this typically occurred in the form of 3-volume novels. A novel would be split into 3 volumes or 3 sections. Some were longer than others, but this often led to very lengthy novels, and the Victorian period was known for its lengthy novels. Even to the point that there's a bit of criticism because some writers would have to fill in with more detail and more prose, that more description that wasn't essential to the narrative and the plot, just to make the novels long enough to fit 3 volumes. That's not the case in all instances, but it did happen. So that's one criticism level against this period. You also have the serialization of novels, where a chapter or 3 to 4 short chapters would be published at a time. Because people were reading all the time now, all the classes, the working class, middle class, and upper class were all reading, you had a lot of people reading journals and magazines and newspapers. And in journals and magazines you'd have the serialization of novels, as in 1 or 2 chapters published at a time. People would read that and eagerly await to see what happens next month as the next section is published. So oftentimes what would happen is novels would be serialized first, and when the serial run was complete, then it would be published in full novel form. Once they were published in full novel form, the main way the working class could access novels was through lending libraries. These are libraries where you'd go and you'd check out 1 volume at a time. This is why publishers wanted the novels split into 3 volumes, and why some writers would work hard to lengthen their novels to fit 3 volumes. Because someone would have to check out 1 volume at a time, bring it back, and get the next one. There was a high demand, so there were waiting lists. And unlike libraries nowadays, these were not free. You'd have to pay to rent these books. Almost like renting a DVD from Redbox, except much more expensive at the time. So there was huge profit to be made in novels, and the Victorian period is recognized for being the period where the novel was born, essentially. Obviously novels were written before then, but where the novel became immensely popular with the wider population for the first time, and also where it was really played a role beyond, before the rise of the novel in the mid-19th century, poetry and drama were mostly written and read by the upper class. I mean, the lower class did see those plays in Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, but for the most part, poetry and drama involved mainly the upper class, maybe some of the middle class, and was this kind of aristocracy, highfalutin thing, mostly the upper class of scholars. And so you didn't have really, literature wasn't really a part of pop culture, so to speak, as much until this period. So the idea of profit coming into play and certain changes being made to the literary work, such as lengthening it to fit 3 volumes, that really, those kind of concerns aren't really significant factors until this time. And from that point on, obviously, there's always profit concerned with art and literary text, and the question of art versus business. And so the Victorian period and the rise of the novel introduces that an important debate. Alright, with some more background on the novel, let's look at Dracula again, look at the second half and the ending to Dracula, since we haven't done that yet. Talk a little bit about the ending, some themes that emerge and are revisited in the second half, and also how these concepts we've just talked about that are specific and unique to the novel, how some of those things play out in Dracula. things that couldn't necessarily be done in a short story or a novella. Obviously, narrative structure is very important in a novel, like we talked about last time. Now we can look at the whole narrative structure, though, since we've read the ending. What's interesting is, as the hunting party, so to speak, which, remember, is Harker, Van Helsing, and the three suitors, Seward, Godalming, and Quincy Jones. Quincy Morris. These five are pursuing Dracula in the second half. Once they realize what he's up to in England with the real estate he's purchased and the coffins, and they've realized the woman terrorizing the children is Lucy, they start to pursue Dracula to try to hunt him down and kill him, remove the threat. So what's interesting is, as that happens, as they pursue him, he eventually returns to Transylvania, and that's where they eventually defeat him. And so we talked about, last time, as Harker goes into the east and goes to Transylvania at the very beginning, there's that constant language that he's going deeper into the east. And then when Dracula comes to England and threatens the women, he's penetrating, invading this domestic space, and you have the idea of this eastern foreign other, this foreign threat invading English soil. Well, following the narrative structure in the end, that foreign threat is pursued back out of England, back to his homeland, and eventually defeated. So that's very symbolic in terms of the threat, the invading threat, being contained, being pursued and defeated. And along those lines, keep in mind that, like I said last time, that the British maintained a vast empire at this time, and the threat of the colonies rising up was a real threat, because there were certain wars, such as the Indian Mutiny of 1857 and multiple Afghan wars during the 19th century, that would have made the threat of invasion and the threat of the colonies rising up a very real threat. So this threat being contained in the conclusion of the novel fits right along with what readers would have expected and wanted to see. And it's interesting Stoker makes that choice, so we'll talk about that more as we go on. So that seems like a very traditional narrative structure, and that you're introduced to the villain in the beginning, you learn the villain's plot, the villain's eventually defeated by a group of Western heroes. So it seems very traditional. So a question I'd like to pose to you, and it'd help to take a few minutes, pause the lecture, and think about, is: are there other ways in which Stoker challenges traditional narrative structure, or is this just a very traditional hero defeats villain novel? It seems like that at the outset, but I do think it's more complicated than that, and I'd like you to think about it, reflect on it some. So that may be something to address in the first part of your discussion board post for this lesson. What's interesting is, when you have a group of individuals like this hunting a villain, usually one doesn't make it. And so, of course, out of this group, it's the American. The only other foreigner out of the five-member hunting party is Van Helsing, but he's the older, wiser, almost leader type of the party. And obviously there's that remaining tension with America from the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. So Americans aren't often portrayed in a positive light in British texts, and vice versa. And so the American is killed off, yet at the same time, the child is named for him. So you've got more than one thing going on there. But it's an interesting thing to think about. Why is Quincy the one that's killed? And that's something you can think about as well in your post when you're addressing the ending of the book. You can write on really anything you want in the post, as long as you address the second half of the novel and then the other questions. So Dracula, thinking of narrative, Dracula does use some experimental techniques that it makes sense to talk about now that we've seen the whole novel. The first is multiple narrators, and reliable versus unreliable narrators. Before the mid-19th century, before novels were more popular, for the most part, you had very reliable narrators. First-person narrators or third-person narrators that you could be trusted. You could think that everything this person says I can take as being on the level. It's almost like a god or an omnipotent force, that they know everything, you can trust everything they say as they're presenting it. As novels became more popular, there was more variety and nuance. Some of the traditional forms were challenged, and you started to see multiple narrators. The first novel I can think of with multiple narrators is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which predates the Victorian period, but not by much. You have a kind of a frame story, a story within a story, because you have the opening narrator in Frankenstein who discovers the main narrator, and then he tells him the story. You also have Wuthering Heights, which is 1847, so right around the time the novel starts to become more popular, by Emily Bronte. And there you have, rather than a story within a story, you have a perspective shifting back and forth. You have an isolated rural setting, and you have a servant from the rural setting, and then a London tourist visiting the rural setting. The perspective alternates back and forth between the two of them. With Wuthering Heights, another level comes into play, and that's the reliable versus unreliable narrator. Can you trust this person? What do they say? Is it reliable? And both the individuals in Wuthering Heights. Frankenstein has layers of narrators and multiple narrators, but for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, they're reliable. Wuthering Heights introduces the idea that they might be unreliable, that they might not be remembering things correctly when they recount the past, that they might be biased or want to represent things in a certain way, and both individuals who narrate that novel are unreliable to a degree, not a great degree, but a significant one for different reasons. As the 19th century goes on, and you have more novels being published constantly for profit, you start to see multiple narrators and unreliable narrators more often. Wilkie Collins, who was a great friend to Charles Dickens, but not as popular as him, was famous for having multiple narrators and unreliable narrators. He wrote what were called sensation novels, which was a very popular form or genre of literature in the 1860s, which these novels were called sensation novels because they typically had focused on some kind of crime, some kind of deep secret being kept that was revealed, maybe some titillating aspects, although at the time that would be very mild compared to now. And so these were very popular, and they were the first kind of genre of fiction, of the novel, that was written primarily for popular audiences and not just for the aristocracy or for scholars. In these sensation novels, Wilkie Collins was the most famous sensation writer, but there were numerous ones. They often followed the epistolary format, which is what Dracula follows. And that's where, rather than having one or two or just a few narrators, you have dozens of narrators perhaps, and the narration is presented in some form other than a text. There's an explanation given of what type of text this is. For instance, Dracula begins with Harker's diary entries. You also have newspaper clippings about the events going on. You get letters back and forth between different characters, and even ship's log entries from the ship that crashes on its way to England with Dracula's coffin. So at least 4 different types of text, so to speak, make up this novel. And Wilkie Collins and the sensation novels were known for following this format, naming different types of text people wrote at the time as the sections or chapters from the novel, compiling those. This gives you a number of different narrators. So you have main characters, small side characters, servants, and police officers, reporters, etc., all narrating this. So you get a lot of perspective, some reliable, some not. What's interesting is Dracula actually begins with the inscription that says on the first page, before the first chapter starts, "How these papers have been placed in sequence will be made manifest in the reading of them. All needless matters have been eliminated, so that a history almost at variance with the possibilities of later-day belief may stand forth as simple fact. There is throughout no statement of past things wherein memory may err, for all the records chosen are exactly contemporary, given from the standpoints within the range of knowledge of those who made them." He says, throughout no statement of past things wherein memory may err. Stoker here is essentially saying that all the narrators are reliable. And I think he's being facetious. If he's not, you kind of have to take him with a grain or a pinch of salt. But I think he's being a bit facetious because he knows what he's intentionally doing with this epistolary format. And I think he knows that some of these narrators are unreliable. So I think he's kind of playing with us there, teasing us, goading us to think about that. So that's definitely something to think about as you reflect on the book, is which narrators are reliable and which are not, and how does that impact your reading and interpretation of the novel. Fragmentation is a huge theme in Dracula, right? People go insane in the course of this book. Their identities become fragmented. Dracula threatens to tear the Western country apart. And so the multiple narrators, the different types of text making up the novel, re-emphasize this theme of fragmentation. Fragmentation is a very modern theme. In modernity, the modernist writers, and Stoker's almost like he's writing the Victorian period, but he's almost like an early modernist writing in 1897. They see the world as a fragmented place, and that's what's troubling to modernist writers about the modern world. So Dracula, we think of it as an old book now, but it's very much addressing these modern concerns in this modern world, at least at the time. Fragmentation being one of them. The emphases the novel places on science, medicine, and technology certainly are a factor there. New forms of technology we already talked about, as well as medicine and science, especially with Van Helsing and Seward. So Dracula is experimental in form and technique to a degree, also traditional in many ways. So think about those different experimental forms, also about the ending, and in the first part of your discussion board question, address what you think of the ending of the novel and how it plays out. Does it challenge the traditional hero defeats villain idea at all, or does it just uphold that? The second part of your discussion board post asks you to look at the cultural context. So choose any one of the very short pieces that are included in that short 40-page section and talk about how it enhances your understanding of the text. I'd like to go over those now to help you with them, give you a little bit more context since I've extensively studied this period. Although I think just reading these texts is very helpful to understanding the novel. So Dracula is the first full-length canonical novel to feature a vampire as the principal antagonist and primary character. But it's far from the first depiction of a vampire in literature. They appeared in many earlier poems, plays, short stories, non-canonical novels, and I mentioned before how Dracula was not canonical, really considered canonical until the 1980s or 90s. But the novels I'm speaking of here were not even, well, maybe a little bit popular at the time, but not really studied at all. Very unheard of novels. Dracula was essentially the first well-known novel, very popular in its day, to feature a vampire as the principal antagonist and primary character. So Dracula is not the origin or the idea of the vampire. That dates back and goes into folklore even, but it is kind of the first modern depiction of the vampire as the main character and helps launch vampires into popularity. Political writings as well, and political cartoons. Vampires being these kind of monstrous figures were often used as a symbol. So in this cultural context section you have political cartoons of the English versus Irish conflict. Stoker was Irish, so keep that in mind. And the theory and criticism goes into that more. But the idea of England kind of taking advantage of Ireland with that relationship and sucking it dry, the way a vampire would with that metaphor. So the whole fangs and the sucking of the blood and the monstrous characterization of vampires makes them an easy metaphor to use in things like political cartoons. So those first few writings in the cultural context section get at the idea that the ideas of vampires, what vampires are, have been around for a long time and are referred to culturally. But Dracula is the first instance of a prominent novel featuring a vampire as a primary character. After that, they go into more context having to do with more than just vampires, but some of the other themes Stoker addresses. This idea of the Eastern other or Eastern foreigner comes up a lot. And you have some writings by Richard Burton, who was a famous traveler who wrote travel writing, British guy who would travel to other countries and write about his experiences there. And in this piece you have by him in the book, he associates vampires with the East and the foreign others. So Stoker's not necessarily inventing that idea. He's drawing on things that are out there in the culture but haven't necessarily been put into a popular novel yet. You also have this criminal element with Cesare Lombroso and Max Simon Nordau. For the first time in the late 19th century, not the mid-19th century, when the novel first became popular, but much later, closer in the 1880s and 1890s, closer to when Stoker's writing Dracula, people started to theorize and talk about crime for the first time, starting to really reflect on why does crime happen, what are the causes, etc., because there was a lot of crime, especially in urban cities like London, where much of Dracula takes place in the late 19th century. And Lombroso and Nordau were two of the more famous, Lombroso being Italian and Nordau German, scholars who talked about crime. Lombroso really focused on crime and detailed the psychology of it, why it was around so much, going into the psychology of why people commit crimes. Nordau was famous for talking about the idea of degeneration, which is exactly what it sounds like, the reverse of evolution, essentially people devolving into lesser life forms, and he attributed degeneration. He called that the main cause of crime. So these are people who were talking about some issues that Stoker draws on, especially when he chooses to present this terrifying figure of Dracula the vampire. The vampire Dracula could be said to be a figure who has experienced degeneration, or even represent Lombroso's criminal man, to use his term. Some other examples of cultural context. You have Richard von Krafft-Ebing, who, this predates Freud. 1897 is right around the time Freud's starting to write. So Krafft-Ebing is like an early psychologist, doing a little bit of what Freud's doing before he's doing it. And in this piece, he gets into science and medicine, like we talked about earlier, and also feminine and the female as well. There are all kinds of medical problems in the 19th century that were unique to women that were not easy to explain, such as postpartum depression after childbirth. It's really sad, but a lot of women were locked up for being insane due to postpartum depression after childbirth and other things. So psychology of the feminine was kind of a new thing, an important thing, and certainly plays a role here when you see what happens to Mina and Lucy. And I should mention again, because we haven't talked about Mina enough, and we're almost done with Dracula, that she's a very interesting figure if you want to talk about her in your posts or your papers. Since she is attacked by Dracula, but she doesn't succumb completely, although she starts to fall under a spell. She doesn't succumb completely like Lucy, and she's able to resist enough to a certain extent to help use her glimpses of him she gets from the bite to help the men find him. So she's very much this kind of middle ground. She's a very independent and autonomous woman for her time. There was a movement in the Victorian period was a very oppressive period for women. In the 1880s, 1890s, there started to be a movement called the New Woman movement, where slowly in novels you'd start to see more independent, more autonomous female characters who weren't submissive. And Mina's a good example of that, or to a certain extent, she's an example of the new woman. That's not Stoker so focused, but she does have some new woman traits. And so she's a very interesting character in that sense. I wish I could do more on her during these lessons, but, again, the idea is for you to build on the lessons and the discussion posts, and then build on the discussion posts in your papers. So Mina's a great place to start discussion there. You also have Karl Marx in the cultural context section, because in 1867, so 30 years before Dracula, he used vampires in metaphor in his essay on capital. And he basically called, capital, the word capital refers to the capitalist machine of selling things for profit to make money, and it's essentially the villain in Marx's works if you haven't read Marx, and he uses the vampire as a metaphor. Capitalism drains the life force of the worker, so to speak. And since then, the idea of a vampiric economy has come about, and oftentimes you'll see that in titles of articles or essays where critics are talking about this book representing a vampiric economy, and that means that what's going on in the text drains the life force of the characters. You also have Fraser, who was one of the most famous early anthropologists from the late 19th century. And anthropology clearly plays a role here, since Stoker's drawing a lot on Transylvanian folklore, etc. Fraser talks about the dead-alive binary, so vampires are technically dead, but they're also still alive. So they play with that binary, and we've talked about the dangers of binaries before, and we'll talk about them more in the next lesson. There's also the dictionary definition of what a vampire is. So really, this whole section contains pretty much everything you would need to know as far as what Stoker knew about vampires at the time, so that he could create this first prominent example of a vampire as a primary villain in a successful novel. So, to conclude the lesson, I've included several trailers for you to watch, as I have before. The difference here is you don't necessarily need to watch the trailers unless you want to, but I would at least like you to take some time and think a little bit about how vampires are represented in our culture. Vampires, zombies, and other undead figures, are enormously popular right now. I mean, obviously you have the Twilight series, the Vampire Diaries, True Blood, numerous other examples, and all of these texts owe something to Dracula. The idea of the vampire existed before then, but it would not be popular in the way it is now if not for Stoker. I know it's over 100 years later, but he brought the character into prominence. People didn't necessarily do a lot with vampires right away, but he put the idea out there that something really powerful can be done with vampires as villains. And now vampires are almost treated as heroes, right? Because you have very sympathetic characters, the plight of the undead vampire who must live forever alone, or, these entire cultures of vampires and things like True Blood, where you have the good vampires and the bad vampires. So, what do you think it is about vampires that have caused them to take on this role? Why are they so popular now, and in what ways can their popularity now be traced back to Stoker and his work? So that's the third and final question I ask you to answer in this post. In the trailers, I have direct adaptations, so those are ones based actually on Stoker's novel, the most popular of which is Coppola's 1992 version with Keanu Reeves, but it's fairly well cast with Gary Oldman as Dracula, Anthony Hopkins as Van Helsing, and some other good actors in there who fit the other roles. Billy Campbell as Quincy Morris, so on and so forth. Coppola does take some liberties, especially in amping up the sexual elements, but in terms of all these adaptations out there actually following the text, it's fairly close. And then there are some other adaptations here that are also based directly on the 10 texts that are older, one with Laurence Olivier and then another even older one. Then you have loose adaptations, some that are kind of taking the character of Dracula and using it in completely different ways. And then you have all these other incarnations of vampires, all the ones I mentioned earlier, other ones like the Marvel Comics character Blade, who's half vampire, half human, hunts vampires. Things like Underworld, where you have wars between vampires and werewolves, and all kinds of stuff. So that third and final question is, what do you make of the proliferation of vampires in our media and culture today? And I should add to that, once you have why you think they're so popular now, how can that be traced in any way back to Stoker and his work? And hopefully these trailers or watching one of these movies will help you with that question if you have time.